The first chill of autumn had just begun to sharpen the morning air in Maple Creek, a pristine suburb nestled west of Cleveland, but a palpable tension was already rising from the manicured lawns like a heavy fog. It was a neighborhood of wrought iron gates, long, winding driveways, and secrets buried deep behind heavy oak doors. On the surface, everything was immaculate. Hydrangeas bloomed in brilliant clusters of blue and violet, and the only sounds were the distant hum of expensive air conditioning units and the buzz of cicadas clinging to the last days of summer. But at the sprawling estate at the end of the cul-de-sac, the air was anything but peaceful. Sarah, a 22-year-old who moved with the quiet caution of someone walking on a frozen lake, had been awake and working for hours. She pushed a damp strand of blonde hair from her face, her eyes sweeping the back patio with a vacant look. She had a fragile beauty, with high cheekbones and large, expressive eyes that seemed to hold a permanent hint of alarm. But her posture was perpetually stooped, as if bracing for a blow. Despite the mild morning temperature, she wore a long-sleeved cotton shirt, buttoned to the collarbone. To an outsider, it was an odd choice, but for her, it was a necessity. The fabric hid a constellation of bruises in various stages of healing, souvenirs from a life lived under a tyrant's rule. Beside her was Kaiser, a 5-year-old German shepherd whose black and tan coat had lost some of its luster. He panted softly, his amber eyes fixed on Sarah with an almost devotional focus. When he shifted to stand, he favored his left hind leg, a permanent limp from a hip injury that had never been properly treated by a vet. They were a pair, the girl and the dog, both bearing the visible and invisible scars of the same household. The sliding glass door to the main house screeched open, shattering the morning's quiet. Frank Miller stepped onto the veranda, a mug of steaming black coffee in his hand. He was a large man in his late 50s, with a gut that strained the fabric of his polo shirt and a face bloated from years of heavy drinking and unrestrained rage. He was the councilman of their prosperous community, a man who smiled for cameras and shook hands at fundraisers. At home, he was someone else entirely. He took a sip of coffee, his face twisting as he surveyed the yard. He offered no greeting. He didn't ask if Sarah needed help with the heavy bags of charcoal she was dragging from the shed. Instead, he glanced at his watch and scowled. "You're moving too slow, Sarah," he grumbled, his voice a gravelly rasp. "They'll be here before noon. I want the grill scrubbed, the patio hose down, and the beer on ice. If I find a speck of rust on that grate, you'll regret it. You understand me?" Sarah flinched, her shoulders instinctively hunching. "Yes, Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She didn't make eye contact. She'd learned long ago that eye contact was considered defiance. She returned to her task, heaving a 20-pound bag of charcoal onto the granite countertop of the outdoor kitchen. Her arms trembled under the weight, her muscles straining. Kaiser let out a low whine, sensing her distress. He nudged his wet nose against her leg, the only comfort he could offer. Frank sneered. "Get that useless mud out of the way," he snapped, waving a dismissive hand. "It stinks like a wet rug. If it trips one of my guests today, I'll put it down myself. I don't know why I let you keep it." Kaiser's ears flattened, but he didn't back away. He simply pressed closer to Sarah, a silent shield against the verbal assault. On the other side of the 6-foot privacy fence that separated the Miller estate from the smaller, more wooded lot next door, Jack Brody stood on the deck of the small guest house he'd rented for the month. He held a mug of coffee, but he wasn't drinking. He was watching through the slats in the wooden fence. Jack, 32, was a man built of dense muscle and sharp angles. He possessed a stillness that belonged only to predators and soldiers. A Navy SEAL on mandatory leave after a deployment went wrong in ways he refused to dwell on, Jack had come here seeking silence. He wanted to escape the noise of war, the shouting, and the constant thrum of adrenaline. Instead, he'd found himself tuning into a different kind of battlefield. He took a sip of his coffee, his dark eyes narrowed as he watched the scene next door. He'd been there 3 days, and in those 3 days, he'd seen enough to make a tactical assessment of the inhabitants. The father was a bully, a man who used volume and size to intimidate. The daughter was the target, and the dog was the only thing keeping her grounded. Jack had noticed the long sleeves immediately. He knew what they meant. He'd seen similar attempts to hide trauma in villages half a world away. He watched Sarah struggle with the heavy bag, his knuckles turning white around his coffee mug. His instinct was to intervene, to vault the fence and neutralize the threat, but he forced himself to remain still. He was a civilian here. He had to play by suburban rules of engagement, no matter how much they sickened him. "Hey," Jack called out softly, modulating his voice so that only the girl might hear. He moved closer to the fence, raising a hand in a friendly gesture. Sarah froze, her eyes widening in panic as she looked toward the fence. She saw the stranger, a man with a military short haircut and an aura of danger that clung to him despite his plain t-shirt and shorts. "Need a hand with that?" Jack asked, his voice low and calm, trying to file the sharp edges off his natural tone. "I can hop over and help you lift those. Looks heavy for one person." For a split second, a flicker of hope crossed Sarah's face, but it was extinguished by the sound of Frank's footsteps on the patio gravel. She shook her head violently, her eyes pleading with Jack to be quiet. "No, thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "I've got it. Please don't." She turned her back on him abruptly, focusing on scrubbing the grill, her hand shaking so badly the wire brush clattered against the metal. Jack exhaled slowly through his nose, a controlled, measured breath. He recognized that fear. It wasn't just social anxiety. It was the terror of a prisoner who knows the warden is watching. He stepped back into the shadows of his deck, but he didn't go inside. He sat in a wicker chair, picked up a book he had no intention of reading, and continued to watch. The morning wore on, and the sun climbed higher, turning the backyard into a humid oven. The air shimmered above the flagstones. Sarah had been working for 4 straight hours without a break. She'd scrubbed the grill, arranged the patio furniture, and was now tasked with unloading heavy coolers of beer from Frank's pickup truck, which was parked awkwardly across the garden path after its starter had failed earlier that morning. The truck sat there like a beached whale, its metal bed radiating heat. Frank sat under the shade of a large umbrella, scrolling on his phone and occasionally shouting directions. "Careful with that one," he yelled as Sarah lifted a case of glass bottles. "That's imported. It's worth more than you are." Sarah's arms were screaming in protest. Sweat soaked her shirt, making the fabric cling to her back. She reached for a heavy bag of ice from the truck bed, but her hands were slick with perspiration. The bag slipped from her grasp and hit the ground with a heavy thud, splitting open. Icy cubes scattered across the pristine lawn, glittering like diamonds in the sun. Frank was out of his chair in an instant. His face was a mask of crimson rage. "You clumsy fool!" he roared, striding toward her. "Look what you did. You're ruining the grass." Kaiser, who had been dozing in the shade of a bush, shot to his feet. He sensed the surge of aggression. Despite his bad hip, he placed himself between Sarah and her father, letting out a low, warning growl. It wasn't an attack. It was a boundary line. It said, "Go no further." Frank didn't stop, blinded by the alcohol he'd already started drinking and his own massive ego. He drew his foot back. "Get out of my way, you cripple!" Frank shouted, and he drove the toe of his expensive leather shoe into the dog's ribs. The sound was a sickening thwack. Kaiser yelped, a sharp, piercing cry of pain, and stumbled back, his legs scrambling for purchase. He didn't snap. He just looked at Sarah, confused and hurt. "No!" Sarah cried, dropping to her knees to shield the dog. "Don't hurt him. It was my fault. Please, Dad, don't." She curled her body around the animal, bracing for a blow. On the other side of the fence, the book fell from Jack's hand. He rose slowly. The casual neighbor was gone. The man who stood there now was the embodiment of military precision. His posture was ramrod straight, his muscles coiled like springs, ready to unspool. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He simply walked to the edge of his deck and gripped the top rail, knuckles white, his dark, unblinking eyes locked on Frank's heaving back. He was classifying the threat level. He was calculating distance and reaction time. The switch inside him, the one he'd been trying to keep off since he came home, had just been flipped back on. He wasn't looking at a bad father anymore. He was looking at a hostile target. The air around him seemed to drop in temperature, a stark contrast to the humid heat. Jack took a deep breath, the smell of charcoal and fear filling his lungs. The invisible walls of suburbia were about to come crashing down. The midday sun hung overhead, a white-hot disk that bleached the color from the sky and turned the estate's backyard into a shimmering cauldron of heat. The air was no longer just humid. It was heavy, oppressive, and thick with the smells of charring meat, stale beer, and the expensive cologne of men sweating through their linen shirts. What had started as a tense morning of preparation had devolved into a loud and sloppy display of gluttony. Frank Miller sat at the head of the patio table like a king holding court in a collapsing kingdom. His face was flushed a deep, unhealthy red. Surrounding him were his cronies, a collection of men who ran the town through backroom handshakes and whispered threats. To his right was Bill Henderson, a local property developer with a neck as thick as a tree trunk and a laugh like a barking seal that was loud enough to rattle the windows. Bill was the kind of man who took up too much space, spreading his arms wide and knocking over condiment jars without apology. Across from him was Officer Davis, a man in his 40s with cold, reptilian eyes and a badge clipped to his belt that he treated more as a license to transgress than a symbol of service. Davis didn't laugh much. He just watched, sipping his whiskey, his gaze following Sarah with a predatory stillness that made her skin crawl. Sarah moved around the periphery of the patio like a ghost, trying to make herself invisible while catering to their every demand. The long sleeves of her shirt were soaked with sweat, clinging to her skin like an uncomfortable second skin, but she didn't dare roll them up. She carried a heavy tray of fresh steaks toward the grill, her arms trembling from hours of exertion. "More ice, sweetheart." Bill Henderson boomed, slamming his empty glass on the glass tabletop, nearly shattering it. "And try to be a little quicker this time. The heat's killing us out here, and you're moving like you're underwater." Frank laughed. A wet, gravelly sound. "She's always slow. Just like her mother, useless in a pinch. But she's free labor, Bill, so I can't complain much." The men chuckled, a low, rumbling sound of shared contempt. Sarah bowed her head, setting the tray on a side table. She could feel Kaiser watching from the shade of an oversized weeping willow near the fence. The dog was panting, his tongue lolling, but his eyes never left her. Every time one of the men raised his voice, Kaiser's ears would twitch and a low vibration would start in his chest, a growl he was too disciplined, or perhaps too afraid of Frank, to fully unleash. On the other side of the wooden fence, the world was quieter, but far more tense. Jack sat in the old wicker chair on his deck, a hardcover book open on his lap, but he hadn't turned a page in 45 minutes. He wore dark sunglasses that hid the direction of his gaze, but his posture gave him away to anyone who knew what to look for. He wasn't relaxed. He was coiled. His breathing was shallow and even, a technique for controlling adrenaline. In his head, he was running through the rules of engagement that had been drilled into him for a decade. Do not engage unless fired upon. Do not engage unless there is a clear and imminent threat to life. But this wasn't a war zone in the Middle East. This was a backyard in Ohio. The lines were blurry here. There was no commanding officer to give the order, only his own conscience warring with the law. He listened to the slurred insults drift over the fence, each one like a drop of acid eating away at his restraint. He despised men like Frank, men who used their power to terrorize the weak instead of protecting them. It went against every code Jack lived by. He tightened his grip on the arm of the chair, the wood groaning under the pressure of his fingers. Not yet, he told himself. Just words. Just drunken words. Stay calm. The atmosphere in the neighboring yard shifted as the alcohol levels rose. The boisterous good humor began to curdle into something darker, more aggressive. Bill Henderson, emboldened by his fourth scotch, reached out as Sarah passed by to collect empty bottles. His large, meaty hand clamped around her thin wrist, the grip surprisingly strong. "You know, Frank," Bill said, his words slurring, looking at Sarah with bleary, bloodshot eyes. "You keep this one hidden away. She's a pretty thing. Why don't you sit and have a drink with us, sweetheart? It's rude to let your guests drink alone." Sarah froze, her heart hammering in her chest like a trapped bird. "No, thank you, sir," she stammered, trying to pull her arm away without making a scene. "I have to check the grill." Bill didn't let go. Instead, he pulled harder, throwing her off balance. "Aw, don't be like that," he sneered, his breath hot and smelling of onions and gin. "Just one drink. Your old man won't mind, will you, Frank?" Frank waved a dismissive hand, too drunk to care about his daughter's discomfort. "Do what the man says, Sarah. Stop being so stuck up." Panic flared in Sarah's chest. She wasn't just afraid of these men. She was terrified of the unpredictable violence that simmered just beneath her father's skin when he felt disrespected. She yanked her arm back with a sudden, desperate strength. The movement was clumsy. Her elbow caught Bill's full Scotch glass, sending it tumbling. The amber liquid splashed all over Bill's expensive linen trousers and down the front of his shirt. The sound of the glass shattering on the flagstones silenced the laughter instantly. For a moment, the only sound was the buzz of flies and the distant hum of a lawnmower. Bill stood up, his face turning a dark shade of purple. You stupid," he trailed off, looking down at the spreading stain on his lap. Frank's expression morphed from drunken indifference to pure, unadulterated rage. His friend had been embarrassed. His hospitality had been stained. In his twisted mind, this was a direct insult to his authority. "Look what you did," Frank roared, the veins in his neck bulging. He shot to his feet so fast his chair tipped over backward with a crash. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll clean it up," Sarah cried, dropping to her knees to pick up the broken shards of glass, heedless of the sharp edges cutting into her fingers. But it was too late. The humiliation had taken root. Frank rounded the table, his heavy footsteps sounding like thunder in Sarah's ears. He bent down, grabbed a handful of her hair, and yanked her to her feet. "You embarrass me in front of my guests?" he hissed, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "You worthless thing." Before Sarah could plead, Frank's hand came up. The slap was brutal, a sharp crack that echoed across the yard. It caught Sarah square on the cheek, spinning her head around. She lost her balance and fell hard onto the grass, gasping in shock. "Hey!" The shout came from over the fence, sharp and commanding, but Frank was too far gone to hear it. He raised his foot, aiming a kick at his daughter's ribs. Suddenly, a blur of black and tan shot out from the shade of the willow tree. Kaiser, despite his injured leg, moved with the ferocity of a wolf. He didn't bark. He just launched himself. His jaws clamped down on Frank's forearm, the arm that was raised to strike. It wasn't a lethal bite. It was an interception, a desperate bid to stop the violence. Frank screamed, more in shock than pain, and flailed wildly. "Get off me! Get off!" he shrieked. He shook his arm, sending the dog flying, who landed awkwardly on his bat hip but was immediately back on his feet to stand between Sarah and her father, snarling, teeth bared in a fearsome defensive display. "I'll kill you, you mutt!" Frank screamed. His eyes darted around for a weapon. He snatched an empty beer bottle from the table. The glass was thick, heavy, and brown. Kaiser held his ground, his body trembling, but his resolve was iron. He would not move. He was the protector. Frank lunged and brought the beer bottle down with all his might. Crack! The sound was as sickening as a dry branch breaking in winter. The bottle didn't just break. It shattered against the side of Kaiser's head. The dog didn't yelp this time. He just collapsed as if made of stone, his legs giving out instantly. A gash opened above his ear, and bright red blood began to pump out, staining the manicured green lawn a horrific, contrasting crimson. Kaiser lay motionless, his breathing shallow and ragged. Frank, panting, looked down at the dog and then at his daughter, who was screaming in a silent, voiceless agony. He raised the jagged, broken neck of the bottle, his eyes wild. "And you?" he spat, stepping over the dog. "You're next." The line had been crossed. The rules of engagement had just changed. On his deck, Jack didn't think. He didn't calculate. The book fell from his lap. He took a 3-step running start, his boots thudding on the wood, and launched himself. He cleared the 6-foot wooden fence in a single, fluid, practiced motion. His hands touched the top rail for a microsecond to pivot his body. He landed on the neighboring lawn in a crouch, the impact absorbed by his knees. He moved like a blur, covering the 30 feet between the fence and the patio in a heartbeat. Frank heard the thud of boots on grass and turned, but he was far too slow. Jack didn't slow down. He stepped inside Frank's swinging arc, caught the wrist holding the broken bottle, and twisted it with a bone-jarring crack that made Frank drop the weapon. In the same fluid motion, Jack drove his fist into Frank's jaw. It was a surgical strike, precise, controlled, and devastating. There was no wasted energy. Frank's head snapped back, his eyes rolled up, and he crumpled to the flagstones, unconscious before he hit the ground. Silence fell over the yard, heavier and more absolute than before. Jack stood over the fallen councilman, his chest rising and falling slightly, his knuckles bruised but unbroken. He slowly turned to face the table. Bill Henderson and Officer Davis had scrambled to their feet, their eyes wide with shock. Davis's hand instinctively moved toward the gun on his hip, but he froze when Jack's gaze locked onto his. It was the look of a man who had faced death 1,000 times and won. It was a look that said, "Give me a reason." "Sit down," Jack said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that froze the air in their lungs. "Unless you want to join him." Davis hesitated, looking at Frank's unconscious form, back at Jack, and slowly raised his hands, backing away from his weapon. Bill just collapsed back into his chair, his face pale, all his bluster gone. Jack turned his back on them, a mark of supreme contempt and confidence, and knelt beside the bleeding dog and the sobbing girl. The war had just come to Maple Creek. The engine of the beat-up 1998 Dodge Ram roared to life with a rattling cough and a shudder that shook the whole frame, a stark contrast to the luxury sedans that normally grace the driveways of Maple Creek. Jack didn't wait for it to warm up. He threw it into gear, his movements precise and forceful. The muscle memory of 1,000 extractions was taking over. Beside him, in the passenger seat, Sarah was curled into a ball, her hands trembling violently as she pressed a blood-soaked t-shirt to the side of Kaiser's head. The big German Shepherd was draped across her lap in the center console, his breathing shallow and ragged, a rattling wheeze that filled the small cab with the terrifying rhythm of life and death. The truck fishtailed slightly as Jack shot out of the driveway, kicking up a cloud of gravel and dust that momentarily obscured the sprawling mansion where Frank Miller lay unconscious on the patio. Jack didn't look back. His eyes were scanning the road ahead, processing potential choke points, traffic patterns, and the fastest route to the veterinary clinic he'd spotted on his way into town 3 days earlier. The AC in the old truck was broken and the windows were down, letting the hot, humid air whip through the cab, carrying the metallic smells of copper and fear. "He's going to kill us," Sarah sobbed, her voice almost lost in the wind and engine noise. She wasn't looking at the road. Her eyes were fixed on Kaiser's closed eyelids. "You don't know him. You don't know what he can do. We have to go back. If I go back now, maybe he won't. Maybe he won't hurt you." Jack gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He glanced in the rearview mirror, checking for pursuit, then looked at Sarah. His voice was calm, a low baritone that cut through her panic like a knife. "Sarah, look at me." She didn't respond, her tears falling onto Kaiser's fur. "Sarah." Jack barked, the command tone of a team leader making her head snap up. "Focus. You're a medic now. Your job is to hold pressure on that wound. If you let go, he bleeds out. Do you understand me? You are the only thing keeping him alive." The order gave her something to cling to. A frantic purpose in the chaos. She nodded, swallowed a sob, and pressed harder on the makeshift bandage. "I've got it," she whispered, her voice shaking but resolute. "I won't let go." Back at the mansion, the afternoon's silence was broken by a pained groan. Frank Miller sat up on the flagstones, clutching the jaw where Jack's fist had connected. The world was spinning, and a dull, throbbing ache radiated through his skull. Bill Henderson and Officer Davis were hovering over him, useless and scared. Davis had reholstered his weapon, his face pale. "Frank, are you okay?" "That guy, he moved like a machine," Davis stammered. Frank spat a mouthful of bloody saliva onto the expensive limestone. His humiliation was a physical weight, burning hotter than the sun. He'd been taken down in his own home, in front of his subordinates, by a nobody. "Get me my phone," Frank growled, his voice thick. Bill scrambled to retrieve the device from the table. Frank didn't call for an ambulance. He dialed a number from memory, his fingers shaking with rage. "Chief," Frank said when the line connected. Police Chief Brody was a man Frank had put in office, a man who knew which side his bread was buttered on. "I need you to listen to me. I've just been attacked. Armed robbery, assault with a deadly weapon." He paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the empty space on the lawn where his daughter had been. "And a kidnapping," he added. He took Sarah. He held a knife to her throat and dragged her into a truck. A black Dodge. "He is armed and extremely dangerous. Brody, I want roadblocks. I want every unit on the road. Shoot on sight." Jack navigated the winding country roads with the skill of a professional driver, avoiding the main highway where he knew the police presence would be heaviest. He kept one hand on the wheel and reached over with the other to check Kaiser's pulse in his neck. It was thready. "Hang on, buddy," Jack muttered. "We're almost there." Sarah looked at Jack, really looked at him for the first time. He was focused, intense, devoid of the fear that was consuming her. "Why?" she asked, her voice small. "Why are you doing this? You could go to jail. You could lose everything." Jack swung the truck onto a paved county road, accelerating. "I took an oath," he said simply, "to protect those who can't protect themselves. That oath doesn't expire just because I'm on leave." He didn't tell her about the rage that had been simmering inside him, or the ghosts of his own failures he was trying to outrun. He just kept driving. Suddenly, a siren wailed to life behind them. Jack checked the rearview mirror. A sheriff's patrol car was coming up fast, red and blue lights flashing, demanding he pull over. It wasn't Officer Davis. This was a fresh unit. Jack's mind raced. He could probably outrun a Crown Victoria on these roads, but that would turn a rescue mission into a high-speed pursuit, endangering Sarah and Kaiser even more. If he stopped, he risked arrest, and Kaiser would likely die in an evidence locker. But if he ran, they might shoot. He looked at Sarah's terrified face, then at the dying dog. "Hold on," Jack said. He didn't speed up. He slowed down, pulling the truck onto the gravel shoulder. "Whatever happens, keep your hands where they can be seen. Don't say a word unless I tell you to." Sarah started to hyperventilate. "They're going to take us back," she gasped. "Please don't stop." "Trust me," Jack said, bringing the truck to a halt. He killed the engine and rolled down his window, placing both hands clearly on top of the steering wheel. The patrol car stopped behind them. A door opened and a young officer got out. Deputy Evans was maybe 24, his uniform crisp, his face lacking the cynical lines of men like Davis. He approached the truck cautiously, his hand on the butt of his pistol, but not drawn. He'd heard the radio call, armed and dangerous suspect, kidnapping in progress. But as Evans drew alongside the driver's side, he didn't see a madman. He saw a man sitting with military discipline. "Driver, step out of the vehicle," slowly, Evans ordered, his voice cracking slightly with nerves. Jack didn't move immediately. He turned his head slowly to face the officer. "Deputy," Jack said, his voice calm and steady. "I have a medical emergency in this vehicle. I am unarmed. I am stepping out." Jack opened the door slowly and got out, hands raised. Evans took a step back, tense. "Turn around. Hands on the truck," Evans shouted. Jack complied, spreading his legs and placing his hands on the hot metal roof. "Deputy, look in the cab," Jack said, urgency creeping into his voice for the first time. "Just look." Evans hesitated, then glanced through the open window. He expected to see a hostage held at gunpoint. Instead, he saw a young woman, sobbing, her clothes covered in blood, cradling a massive dog whose head was wrapped in a soaked t-shirt. The dog let out a low moan, a sound of pure agony. Sarah looked up at the officer, her eyes pleading. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "He's dying. My father. He broke his head. Please just let us go. He needs a doctor." Evans froze. The call said kidnapping. It said armed robbery. The scene in front of him told a different story. He saw the bruises on Sarah's arms, now visible where her sleeve had ridden up in the struggle. He saw the dog's shattered head. He saw Jack, standing ready to be cuffed, but radiating an energy of desperate, protective urgency. Evans had joined the force to help people, not to be a pawn in town politics. He knew who the councilman was. He knew the rumors. He took his hand off his gun. The radio on his shoulder crackled. "Unit 4. What's your status? Do you have eyes on the suspect?" It was Chief Brody's voice, harsh and demanding. Evans looked at the blood on the girl's hands. He looked at the dog taking shallow breaths. He made a choice. He keyed his mic. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. Negative contact on that vehicle. Just a farmer hauling equipment. Must have missed him at the turnoff. Continuing patrol." Jack let out a breath, his shoulders slumping slightly. Evans looked at him, his gaze hard but compassionate. "There's a vet clinic on Route 9, about 5 miles north. Dr. Reed. She's the only one open on a Sunday. Go." Jack nodded, a silent, profound message of gratitude passing between the two men. "Thank you," Jack said. He climbed back in the truck. Evans turned and walked back to his patrol car, deliberately blocking the road to delay any other units that might be coming. Jack hit the gas, gravel spitting as the truck shot back onto the pavement. "He let us go," Sarah whispered, disbelief thick in her voice. "Why?" Jack shifted gears, the speedometer climbing. "Because not everyone is like your father, Sarah. Now hold on tight. We've got 5 miles to save a life." The clinic was a single-story brick building set back at the end of a long gravel driveway, flanked by old-growth oak trees, completely hidden from the main road. A weathered wooden sign swung gently in the breeze, Creekwood Veterinary Services. It looked more like a grandmother's cottage than a medical facility, which was exactly how Dr. Helen Reed liked it. Helen was a woman in her late 60s with silver gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that had seen the worst of humanity and the best of animals. A former combat medic who had retrained as a veterinarian after 20 years of service, she moved with a brisk efficiency that belied her age. She was already at the door when Jack's truck skidded to a halt, alerted by the call he'd made 2 miles out. She wasted no time on pleasantries. As Jack jumped out and lowered the tailgate, Helen was there, her hands already gloved. "Head trauma?" she asked, her voice a gravelly rasp from years of a smoking habit she'd kicked a decade ago. "Blunt force," Jack answered, lifting Kaiser's heavy, limp body with a gentleness that contrasted with his strength. "Beer bottle. Heavy bleeding. He's barely responsive." Helen peeled back the blood-soaked t-shirt Sarah had been holding. She hissed through her teeth, a sharp intake of breath. "Get him inside. Table 1. Move." The inside of the clinic smelled of antiseptic, alcohol, and something faintly pleasant, like dried lavender. It was a sterile counterpoint to the chaotic, sun-drenched violence of the councilman's backyard. Jack carried Kaiser into the surgical suite, a gleaming room of stainless steel and monitors. He laid the dog down on the cool metal table. "I need to scrub in, Helen," Jack said, already moving toward the sink. "You're short-staffed on a Sunday." Helen didn't argue. She knew Jack's history. She knew he could stitch a wound as well as any field surgeon. Go, she ordered. Jenny, get the girl to the waiting room. Keep her warm. Get her calmed down. I can't have her passing out in here. Jenny, a vet tech in her 20s with soft features and scrubs printed with cartoon paws, stepped forward. She looked at Sarah, who was standing in the doorway, catatonic, her shirt caked with Kaiser's blood and her face swelling from her father's slap. Come with me, honey, Jenny said gently, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. Sarah flinched violently at the touch, recoiling. Jenny didn't take offense. She simply withdrew her hand and offered a warm smile. It's okay. You're safe here. No one is going to hurt you. Let's go get you some water. Sarah looked at Jack, her eyes pleading for him not to leave her. But Jack was already scrubbing in up to his elbows, his back turned, his entire focus on the task of saving Kaiser. Left with no other choice, Sarah allowed herself to be led into the small, cozy waiting room. The waiting room was filled with the soft light of a corner lamp. Jenny guided Sarah to a plush armchair. Sit, Jenny said softly. She disappeared for a moment and came back not with water, but with a steaming mug of hot cocoa and a first aid kit. Dr. Reed keeps this for clients, Jenny explained, kneeling beside Sarah. It helps with shock. She pulled out an antiseptic wipe. I'm just going to clean the cut on your cheek. Is that okay? It looks angry. Sarah sat frozen, her hands wrapped around the warm mug. She was waiting for the sting, for the roughness she was used to. But Jenny's touch was featherlight. She cleaned the wound, applied a cooling gel, and placed a small bandage over it. There, Jenny whispered, you're going to be okay. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, hot and fast. It wasn't from the pain, but from the kindness. For years, every touch she had known had been a demand or a punishment. This simple act of care from a stranger, broke the dam she had built around her heart. In the operating room, the air was tense. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound. Helen was carefully picking shards of brown glass out of the deep laceration in Kaiser's skull. It missed the brain by a millimeter, Helen muttered, her brow furrowed in concentration. But the swelling is severe. Jack, hold that clamp steady. Jack stood opposite her, his face a mask of focus. He held the instrument with hands as steady as stone. He's a fighter, Jack said, more to himself than to Helen. He took the blow for her. He didn't even hesitate. Helen glanced up at him for a moment. Animals don't have the capacity for deceit, Jack. It's why I prefer them to people. They love you or they don't. They protect you or they run. It's honest. After the main fragments were removed and the bleeding was controlled, Helen called a pause while the anesthetic deepened. Go take a breath, Helen told him. I need to prep the suture kit. Go check on the girl. She looked like she was about to shatter. Jack nodded, pulling off his gloves. He walked out to the waiting room. He found Sarah staring into her cocoa, her tears silently dripping into the dark liquid. He sat in the chair across from her, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. He's holding on, Jack said quietly. Helen's the best there is. If anyone can save him, it's her. Sarah looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. Why does he love me so much? She asked, her voice breaking. I couldn't protect him. I let him get hurt. Jack shook his head. You didn't let anything happen. You survived. That's what you did. He looked toward the closed door of the surgical suite, a shadow passing over his face. I had a partner once, Jack began, his voice dropping, taking on a rougher texture. A Belgian Malinois named Rex. We were in Kandahar. We were clearing a compound and we missed a tripwire. Rex didn't. He smelled it. He blocked me. He took the full force of the blast. Jack paused, his jaw tightening at the memory. I carried him 3 miles back to the extraction point. I kept telling him he was a good boy, that we were going home, but I couldn't save him. He died in my arms before the medevac landed. Sarah listened, breathless, seeing the pain etched into the hard lines of Jack's face. I swore that day, Jack continued, looking directly into Sarah's eyes, that if I ever got a chance to change the outcome, if I ever had a chance to save a protector, I wouldn't fail. Not again. Kaiser's not just a dog, Sarah. He's the better part of all of us, and I am not going to let him die. For the first time, Sarah didn't see a frightening soldier or a stranger. She saw a man who carried wounds just as deep as hers. Only his were on the inside. She reached out, her hand trembling, and laid it on Jack's arm. It was a hesitant, fleeting connection, but it bridged the gap between their two broken worlds. Suddenly, a high, continuous sound pierced the air. Beep. It was the sound every medic dreads, the flatline of a stopped heart. Jack was on his feet before the sound fully registered in Sarah's brain. He burst back into the operating room. Helen was already checking vitals, her face pale. "He's coding." Helen shouted. "Jack, I need you to start compressions, now." Kaiser lay still on the table, his chest no longer rising and falling. The monitor painted a flat green line across the screen. Jack didn't hesitate. He positioned himself over the dog's chest, lacing his hands together. "Come on, buddy," Jack growled, putting his weight down in a powerful, rhythmic cadence. "Don't you quit. Not today." 1, Helen counted, managing the airway. Again. Jack pumped the dog's chest, his own sweat dripping onto the metal table. The seconds stretched into an eternity. 10 seconds, 20, nothing. The room felt cold, the silence beneath the alarm deafening. "Jack," Helen began, her voice heavy with resignation. "He's gone." "No," Jack roared. He didn't stop. He leaned down, placed his mouth over Kaiser's muzzle, forced a powerful breath into the dog's lungs, and went back to compressions. "You are not dying. Breathe." He slammed his hands on his chest one more time, pouring all his will, all his regret for Rex into that one movement. He was fighting death itself, wrestling the dog's spirit back into its body. 30 seconds. Jack performed one last compression and a final, desperate breath. Suddenly, a jagged line appeared on the monitor. Beep. Then another. Then a rattling cough erupted from the table. Kaiser's chest rose. The flat line had broken into a steady, albeit weak, rhythm. Beep. 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 Jack collapsed against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor, his chest heaving. Helen let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. She looked at Jack, then at the monitor. "He's back," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "You stubborn son of a bitch. You brought him back." Jack looked at the dog, tears of relief mixing with the sweat on his face. He had kept his vow. The Hocking Hills National Forest was a world away from the manicured lawns and oppressive heat of Maple Creek. Here the air was crisp and smelled of pine needles, damp earth, and an ancient freedom. The cabin was tucked away at the end of a forgotten logging road, a solid structure of rough-hewn logs and stone that had belonged to Jack's grandfather. It was off-grid, with no electricity, no running water, and certainly no cell service. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, wrapped in the protective embrace of towering fir trees that blotted out the sky and the prying eyes of the world. For the past 3 days, it had been their fortress. Jack had driven them deep into the hills after leaving Dr. Reed's clinic, making sure to leave no tire tracks on main roads. The truck was hidden under a camouflage tarp behind the woodshed, and the cabin, normally cold and empty, now glowed with the warmth of a constantly burning fire. Inside, the atmosphere was one of quiet healing. Kaiser, his head still wrapped in clean white bandages, lay on a thick rug before the stone fireplace. His recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Though he still tired easily, the pained look was gone from his amber eyes, replaced by a watchful intelligence. He had accepted Jack not just as a savior, but as the new alpha of their small, broken pack. Wherever Jack went, whether to split firewood or check the perimeter, Kaiser would limp along behind him, his tail giving a slow, rhythmic thump of thanks. For Sarah, the transition was harder. She moved through the cabin with the same jumpy reflexes she'd learned in her father's house, apologizing whenever a floorboard creaked, or a spoon clattered against a bowl. But Jack was dismantling her fear brick by brick, not with words of pity, but with the steady, demanding rhythm of survival. He didn't treat her like a victim. He treated her like a capable human being. On the 4th afternoon, the lesson was fire. The hearth had burned down to embers, and the mountain chill was creeping in. Jack knelt by the fireplace, arranging kindling with precise movements. "Your turn," he said, handing Sarah a box of wooden matches and a piece of flint. Sarah hesitated, her hands trembling. I can't," she stammered. "Frank never let me touch the fireplace. He said I'd burn the house down because I was so clumsy." Jack didn't look up. He didn't validate the insult. "Frank's not here," Jack said, his voice calm and steady. "Fire is just energy, Sarah. It respects control, not fear. Build the structure. Give it air. Strike the match." Sarah took a deep breath. Her hand shook as she struck the match against the box. It flared to life. She dropped it in a panic. Jack gently took her wrist before she could pull away. "Try again," he said. "Control the flame. Don't let it control you." It took 3 tries, but finally a small orange tongue of flame licked at the dry moss and caught the kindling. As the fire grew, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Sarah stared into it. A small, hesitant smile touched her face. It was the first time in years she had created warmth instead of just cleaning up the ashes. "I did it," she whispered. Jack looked at her, the firelight reflecting in his dark eyes. "You did. Don't ever let anyone tell you you're helpless. You survived him. That makes you stronger than he'll ever be." That evening, while Sarah washed the tin plates in a basin of water Jack had fetched from the creek, Jack stepped out onto the porch. The night was vast and silent, the stars hanging low and bright without the interference of city lights. He pulled a heavy black satellite phone from his tactical bag. It was a device he wasn't technically supposed to have, a relic from his last mission, but right now it was their lifeline. He dialed a secure number. "Evans," a sharp voice answered on the second ring. Commander Evans was a JAG officer, a man Jack had served with years ago. Evans was cynical, brilliant, and owed Jack his life. "Evans, it's Brody. I'm going dark, but I need you to listen," Jack said, his voice low. He quickly summarized the situation: the assault, the dog, the corrupt police chief, and the false kidnapping charge. "I need you to get out ahead of this," Jack instructed. "If they pin a kidnapping charge on me, my career is over and this girl goes back to hell. I need you to find medical records, the dog's vet report, her history of ER visits, build a case for defense of another." Evans was silent for a moment, the static of the satellite connection hissing in Jack's ear. "You're walking a razor's edge, Jack," Evans finally said. "The councilman is already all over the news. He's playing the part of the grieving father perfectly. But if you have the girl's testimony, and if the vet backs you up, I can turn this into a federal case. I can take jurisdiction away from the local chief. Just stay hidden. Don't let them find you until I have the paperwork filed." Jack disconnected the call, looking back through the window. Sarah was sitting on the rug next to Kaiser, reading an old paperback. She looked peaceful. For a moment, just a moment, they looked like a family. That peace was shattered the next morning by a simple piece of paper. Jack had gone down to the creek to fish, leaving Sarah alone in the cabin. She decided to organize the pile of supplies Jack had carried in the truck. Wrapped around a bundle of beef jerky was a local newspaper Jack must have picked up at a gas station on the outskirts of Maple Creek before they went into the wilderness. As she unwrapped the jerky, the massive headline hit her in black, bold letters: "Hero, vet, or armed maniac? Councilman's daughter abducted." Below it was a picture of her, taken at a gala years ago where she looked miserable, and a photo of Jack pulled from his military file. The article painted Jack as unstable, violent, and heavily armed. But it was the paragraph at the end that made her heart stop. "Councilman Frank Miller is announcing a $50,000 reward for information leading to the suspect's capture and the safe return of his daughter." Sarah dropped the paper as if it were burning her skin. $50,000. That was enough money to turn anyone into a manhunter. She looked around the cabin, this beautiful, safe place, and suddenly saw it as a trap. She was the bait. Jack was risking his freedom, his career, his entire life for her. And she was just a burden, a runaway who couldn't stand up to her own father. Guilt washed over her like a tidal wave. If she left, if she went back and told the police she'd run away on her own, maybe they'd let Jack go. She could save him. Night fell heavy and cold. The wind moaned through the trees, covering the sound of the cabin door easing open. Sarah had waited until Jack's breathing had deepened into sleep. She'd packed a small bag with water and the rest of the beef jerky. She put on the thick jacket Jack had loaned her. Kaiser was asleep by the hearth, but as she stepped onto the porch, his ears twitched. He let out a low whine, but didn't bark. He sensed her sorrow. Sarah stepped off the porch, the frozen ground crunching under her boots. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away from Jack to save him. She made it about 50 yards toward the logging road, tears freezing on her cheeks, when a shadow detached itself from the tree line. It wasn't a menacing shadow. It was a solid, unmovable object. "Going somewhere?" Jack's voice was calm, devoid of anger. Sarah gasped, spinning around. Jack stood there, arms crossed over his chest, looking like a part of the forest itself. "I have to go," Sarah sobbed, backing away. "I saw the paper. Jack, the reward. They'll hunt you. You're a Navy SEAL. You have a life. I'm just trouble. If I go back, I can tell them I forced you. I can tell them I stole the truck." She was babbling, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "Please, just let me go. I can't let you go to prison for me." Jack closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't grab her. He just placed his hands on her shoulders, the grip firm and steady, stopping her, trembling. Stop, he said gently. Look at me. Sarah looked up, her face a mess of tears. You think you're protecting me? Jack asked. You think going back to a man who beats you and kills the things you love is going to save me? It won't. It will just destroy you. And if you're destroyed, then I've already failed. He bent down so his eyes were level with hers. The moonlight caught the sharp planes of his face, softening them. I didn't bring you up here because I wanted to be a hero, Sarah. I brought you here because you deserve a chance to live, not just exist. Live. He gently turned her around, pointing back toward the cabin, where the warm orange light of the fire spilled out onto the frosted ground. Through the window, they could see Kaiser lift his head, waiting for them. We're a team now, Jack said, his voice ringing with the absolute conviction of his creed. You, me, and the dog. We fight together. We survive together. And a SEAL never, ever leaves a team member behind. Do you understand? Sarah looked at the cabin, then back at Jack. The loneliness of the forest didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt fortified. She took a shaky breath and nodded. I understand, she whispered. Jack put an arm around her shoulders, shielding her from the wind. Good, he said. Now, let's go home. It's freezing out here. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of the Hocking Hills forest, casting dappled shadows on the mossy bank of the creek that ran behind the cabin. The water was crystal clear and ice cold, tumbling over smooth river stones with a meditative, ceaseless rhythm. Jack stood knee-deep in the frigid current, washing a small load of clothes on a flat-topped boulder. He moved with a methodical patience, his breath visible in the crisp air. On the bank, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, Sarah sat on a fallen log, watching him. Kaiser was beside her, contentedly chewing on a pine cone, his bandaged head cocked occasionally at the sound of a bird call. The scene was idyllic, a moment of suspended time, but the conversation that hung in the air was heavy with the weight of reality. Jack wrung out a shirt and waded back to the bank, his boots squelching. He didn't sit. He stood like a sentinel, looking down at Sarah. We can't stay here forever, Jack said, his voice blending with the sound of the water. Winter is coming early in these hills, and men like your father, they don't stop hunting until they've won or they're destroyed. You saw the paper. He's controlling the narrative right now. To the world, he's the grieving victim and you're the lost child. We have to change the story. Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. How? She asked, her voice small. He owns the police. He owns the papers in Maple Creek. No one will believe me. Jack knelt, picked up a smooth stone, and skipped it across the creek. It hopped 3 times before sinking. We don't go to the local papers, Jack explained. We go over their heads. We go to people he can't buy. Evans gave me a contact, an investigative journalist named Jessica Flynn. She won a Pulitzer for exposing corruption. She's tough. She's fair. And she hates bullies. But she needs proof. She needs to hear it from you. He turned to face her fully. You have to tell the truth, Sarah. All of it. The bruises, the threats, what he did to Kaiser. You have to pull his mask off. Sarah looked down at Kaiser, who sensed the shift in her mood, stopped chewing, and rested his heavy head on her knee. She traced the line of the bandage on his skull. If she stayed silent, this would happen again. Maybe not to her, but to someone else. Or maybe next time, Kaiser wouldn't survive. A flicker of anger, hot and unfamiliar, ignited in her chest. It burned through the fear. Okay, she whispered, lifting her chin. I'll do it. Meanwhile, 200 miles away, in a cramped, smoke-filled office in downtown Cleveland, a man named Gareth Mole slouched in front of a bank of glowing computer monitors. Mole was a private investigator in the loosest sense of the term. He was a fixer for the rich, a man who specialized in finding things that didn't want to be found. He was in his 40s with thinning hair, a complexion that spoke of a diet of fast food and energy drinks, and fingernails that were never quite clean. He wore a rumpled suit that smelled of stale cigarettes. Frank Miller had hired him 2 days ago, paying a retainer that could buy a new car with the promise of double on completion. Mole took a bite of a greasy hamburger and tapped a key on his keyboard. A digital map on the center screen blinked, a red dot pulsing in the middle of a sea of green. Gotcha, Mole mumbled, wiping crumbs from his chin. He had been monitoring specific frequency bands used by older military-grade satellite phones. It was a long shot, but desperate men made mistakes. Jack's call to the JAG office in D.C. had been encrypted, so Mole couldn't hear the contents, but the triangulation data was unmistakable. He picked up his phone and dialed a private number. Mr. Councilman, Mole said when the line connected, his voice greasy with feigned reverence. I hope you have your checkbook ready. "I've found your little bird. They're camped out in the Hocking Hills National Forest. I'm sending the coordinates now." On the other end of the line, Frank Miller, sitting in his darkened study with a glass of scotch, smiled for the first time in days. It was a cold, predatory smile. "You'll get your money," Frank said. "Just make sure the information is exclusive. I don't want the police getting there before I do." Back at the cabin, the afternoon light was fading into the gray of dusk. Jack had set up a small area near the window where the light was best. He propped his smartphone on a stack of firewood. The battery was low, but it would be enough for this. "Just talk," Jack said gently, standing behind the camera. "Don't think about an audience, just look at the lens and tell it like you were telling me." Sarah sat on a wooden stool. She had taken off the thick jacket. She rolled up the sleeves of her shirt, exposing the fading yellow and purple bruises on her arms. She leaned down and called Kaiser. The dog limped over and sat beside her, his bandaged head clearly in frame. Sarah took a deep breath, her heart hammering in her chest like a trapped bird. She looked into the dark eye of the camera lens and pictured her father's face. "My name is Sarah Miller," she began, her voice shaky at first before it found its strength. "My father is Councilman Frank Miller, and everything he has told you is a lie." For 10 minutes, she spoke. She talked about the years of isolation, the verbal abuse, the physical intimidation. She described the barbecue, the drinking, and the moment her father smashed a beer bottle over the head of the only creature who had ever tried to protect her. She pulled Kaiser closer, showing the stitches on his head. "This wasn't a kidnapping," she said, tears streaming down her face, but her eyes were fierce. "This was a rescue. Jack didn't take me. He saved me. And if I go back, I know I won't survive." Jack hit stop. The silence in the cabin was profound. It felt as if a weight had been lifted from the room, replaced by the thrumming energy of the truth. "You did good," Jack said quietly. "That was brave." Sarah wiped her face, exhausted, but feeling lighter than she had in years. "Send it," she said. Jack connected the phone to the satellite uplink. The connection was slow and spotty deep in the woods. A progress bar appeared on the screen. "Uploading. 10%, 20%, the little blue bar crawled forward with agonizing slowness. Outside, the wind began to pick up, whistling through the gaps in the logs. Jack paced the floor, his instincts on high alert. He checked his watch. It had been 4 hours since his call to Evans. If someone was listening, if someone was tracking. He pushed the thought away. They were in the middle of nowhere. 50%? Sarah watched the screen, mesmerized. "Do you think she'll watch it?" she asked. "Jessica Flynn." Jack nodded. "She'll watch it. And once she puts it online, it'll be out of your father's hands. The truth spreads faster than fire." 70%. 80%. The cabin grew darker as the sun sank behind the mountain ridge. Jack went to the window to close the shutters. He paused, his hand on the latch. He narrowed his eyes into the gloom. The forest was usually noisy at dusk. Owls, crickets, the rustle of small animals. But tonight it was silent. Too silent. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. "Jack?" Sarah asked, sensing his tension. "Almost there. 90%. Jack didn't answer. He turned to Kaiser. The dog was standing in the middle of the room, facing the door. The hackles on his back, along his spine, were raised in a stiff, straight line. A low, menacing growl rumbled deep in his chest, a sound completely different from the playful noises he'd made earlier. This was a combat growl. "Get away from the window," Jack ordered, his voice dropping to a whisper. He moved quickly to the fireplace, grabbing the heavy iron poker. He had no gun. He'd left his service weapon secured in a lockbox back in Maple Creek to avoid legal entanglements, a decision he was now profoundly regretting. 98%, 99%. Sent. The notification popped up on the screen with a cheerful ding. The video was gone. It was in the cloud. It was in Jessica Flynn's inbox. "It's sent," Sarah breathed, turning to smile at Jack. But the smile died on her lips when she saw his face. "Get down," Jack hissed. "Now." Kaiser barked, a sharp, explosive sound that echoed off the wooden walls. At that exact moment, the darkness outside was shattered. 2 brilliant white beams of light cut through the gaps in the logs and the window, illuminating the dust motes in the air. The roar of a powerful engine, not a police cruiser, but a heavy-duty off-road vehicle, tore through the sanctuary's silence. Tires crunched aggressively on the frozen gravel of the drive. Then another set of lights appeared, and another. They were surrounded. Jack grabbed Sarah and pulled her into the corner of the room behind the heavy stone chimney. They found us, Jack said, his eyes scanning the room for anything else he could use as a weapon. Stay behind me. Hold on to Kaiser. The slam of car doors echoed from outside. Heavy boots crunched on the porch steps. A voice, familiar and terrifying, shouted from the darkness, "Jack. I know you're in there. Come on out, and maybe I won't burn the place to the ground." It was Frank. And he hadn't come alone. The first beam of a high-powered flashlight cut through a window, sweeping across the cabin walls like the searching eye of a predator. It paused on the stone fireplace, then jerked toward the kitchen. Outside, the low rumble of idling engines and the slamming of car doors had obliterated the mountain's silence. Jack moved with a speed that defied the darkness. He didn't panic. He executed. He grabbed a standing bucket of water from beside the hearth and doused the fire in one fluid motion. The cabin plunged into absolute, suffocating blackness, the hiss of steam the only sound left in the void. "Stay down," Jack whispered, his voice a vibration right next to Sarah's ear. "Behind the chimney. Get a hand on Kaiser's collar. Don't let him bark. Don't move until I say clear. You understand?" Sarah, hunkered down in the dust and ash, nodded frantically in the dark, her fingers digging into Kaiser's fur. The dog was vibrating with tension, a low growl rumbling in his throat, but he obeyed Jack's silent command to hold position. Jack was no longer a handyman or a neighbor. He was a ghost in his own element. He drew a small, curved karambit knife from his boot, not for killing, but for utility, and melted into the shadows of the back room. Outside, Frank Miller stood by the hood of his SUV, his breath pluming in the cold air. He looked wild, his eyes wide and bloodshot, a silver snub-nosed revolver clutched in a sweaty hand. Beside him were three men he'd hired through Gareth Mole's contacts. They weren't soldiers. They were street enforcers from Cleveland. There was Brick, a towering block of muscle with a shaved head and a pair of spiked knuckles on his right hand. Rat, a thin, twitchy man with a switchblade. And Kruger, the leader, a scarred ex-con carrying a pump-action shotgun. "I want the girl alive," Frank hissed, waving the pistol toward the darkened cabin. "The man, if he gives you any trouble, you put him down. We'll make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Just do it." Kruger spat on the frozen ground and racked the slide of his shotgun. "Kill the lights," Kruger grunted. "He knows we're here. Brick, you take the back. Rat, side window. I'm going in the front with the boss." Jack was already outside. He had slipped through a loose floorboard in the pantry that led to the crawlspace, emerging silently into the frigid night air under the porch. He lay flat, listening. He heard the heavy tread of footsteps moving toward the rear of the cabin. That would be the big one. Jack rolled out from under the porch, blending perfectly into the shadow of the woodpile. Brick rounded the corner, sweeping a heavy flashlight beam. He never saw Jack. Jack rose from the darkness like smoke, stepping into Brick's blind spot. He kicked the back of the man's knee, forcing it to buckle. And before Brick could yell, Jack had applied a sleeper hold, cutting off the blood flow to the brain. It took 6 seconds. The giant slumped to the ground, unconscious. Jack dragged him into the tall grass and zip-tied his hands with a tie he'd palmed from his pocket. One down. On the east side of the cabin, Rat was trying to pry open a window shutter. He was making too much noise, scratching at the wood with his knife. Jack picked up a small rock and threw it at a pine tree 10 yards away. Thwack! Rat spun around, knife raised. "Who's there?" he hissed. He took a few steps toward the tree, peering into the darkness. It was his mistake. Jack dropped from the low-hanging branch of an oak tree above him, landing silently. He didn't use the knife. He used a precise palm heel strike to the solar plexus that knocked the wind out of the man, followed by a swift chop to the temple. Rat went down without a sound. Jack checked his pulse. Strong, just unconscious. He tied the man up and moved toward the front. 2 down. Frank and Kruger were getting impatient. "Why is it so quiet?" Frank demanded, his voice pitching higher. "Brick, Rat, report." Silence answered him, just the moan of the wind through the firs. Kruger narrowed his eyes, swinging the shotgun barrel left and right. "Something's not right," Kruger growled. "This guy ain't just a neighbor, councilman. You didn't tell me he was an operator." Frank, blinded by desperation, didn't care. "He's one man. Kick the door in." Kruger hesitated, then stepped up to the heavy oak door. He raised his foot and kicked the lock plate with enormous force. Wood splintered. The door flew open, crashing against the interior wall. "Sarah!" Frank screamed, shining his flashlight into the black abyss of the main room. "Come out now, and I won't hurt the dog. Don't make me come in there." He stepped over the threshold, gun raised. Kruger followed, shotgun at his shoulder. Suddenly, a length of paracord Jack had strung across the doorway at ankle height went taut. Kruger tripped, pitching forward violently. His shotgun discharged into the floor with a deafening blast, sending splinters of wood flying. As Kruger stumbled to his feet, a shadow dropped from the rafters above the entryway. It was Jack. He landed squarely on Kruger's back, driving the man's face into the floor. Jack grabbed the shotgun, twisted it free, and threw it across the room. He delivered a short, controlled elbow strike to the back of Kruger's neck. The mercenary went limp. Frank was alone. He spun around, shining the light wildly. He saw his 3 hired men were gone or incapacitated. He saw Jack rising slowly from the floor, empty-handed, but looking like the angel of death. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Frank's mind. He backed away, swinging the light until it landed on the chimney. There, huddled in the corner, was Sarah. "You!" Frank shrieked, leveling the pistol at her chest. "You did this. You ruined everything, you ungrateful brat." His finger tightened on the trigger. He wasn't thinking about elections anymore. He was thinking about erasing the source of his shame. "Dad, no!" Sarah cried, throwing her hands up. "Stop!" Jack yelled, moving forward, but he was too far away to reach the gun in time. From the darkness beside Sarah, a low growl erupted into a roar. Kaiser, the protector, who had been waiting for this moment, launched himself, ignoring the pain in his healing skull, ignoring his limp. He became a missile of fur and teeth. He didn't go for the throat, he went for the weapon. Kaiser's jaws clamped down on Frank's right forearm with the crushing force of a hydraulic press. Crack! Frank screamed, a high-pitched sound of agony, and the gun went off. Bang! A single round flew harmlessly into the ceiling. He dropped the weapon as Kaiser ripped him sideways, throwing the heavy man off balance and onto the floor. Kaiser didn't let go. He stood over Frank, snarling inches from his face, daring him to move. Jack was there in a flash. He kicked the pistol into a corner and pinned Frank to the floor, his knee on the councilman's back. He grabbed Frank's uninjured arm and wrenched it behind his back. "It's over, Frank," Jack said, his voice deadly calm. "You're done." Frank was sobbing, clutching his shattered arm. "Get it off me. Get that monster off me." Suddenly, the room was flooded with flashing red and blue lights pouring through the open door. The sound of heavy tires on gravel and wailing sirens filled the air, drowning out the wind. "FBI, state police, drop your weapons. Come out with your hands in the air," a voice boomed over a loudspeaker. Jack looked up. Through the open door, he could see a dozen armed officers in tactical gear swarming the clearing, their rifles trained on the cabin. The video had worked. Jessica Flynn hadn't just posted it. She had sent it directly to the governor and the FBI field office in Columbus. The cavalry hadn't come for a kidnapping suspect. They had come for a corrupt politician. Jack slowly raised his hands, shifting his weight off Frank, but still keeping him pinned. "Kaiser, here," he commanded softly. The dog immediately released Frank's arm and limped back to Sarah, sitting in front of her and licking her trembling hands. Sarah looked at Jack, then at the police lights flooding their sanctuary. She wasn't crying anymore. She stood up, stepping out from behind the chimney, her hand resting on Kaiser's head. She looked at her father, moaning on the floor, broken and defeated. "Clear," Jack whispered to her, a small, tired smile touching his lips. "We did it." The seasons had turned, trading the oppressive heat of that fateful summer for the crisp, golden embrace of late October. In the rolling hills just outside the county line, far from the iron gates and quiet secrets of Maple Creek, the world was alive with color. The maples and oaks burned with crimson and orange, their leaves carpeting the grounds of what was once the derelict Miller farm. Now, however, the property was transformed. A fresh coat of white paint gleamed on the farmhouse, and the barn had been reinforced and insulated. Above the main gate, a new wooden sign swung gently in the autumn breeze, hand-carved with bold, inviting letters, Kaiser's Haven Rescue Center. It was a place of second chances, a sanctuary built on the ruins of a nightmare. Sarah Miller stood on the porch, a mug of hot cider in her hands, watching the bustle of activity in the main yard. She looked different. The girl who hunched her shoulders to hide bruises and flinched at loud noises was gone. In her place was a woman who stood tall, her skin healthy and glowing, dressed in a thick flannel shirt and jeans smudged with dirt from a morning's work. She was no longer just existing. She was thriving. 6 months had passed since the night the state police lights had flooded the cabin in the Hocking Hills. The wheels of justice, so often slow, had turned with terrifying speed, fueled by the undeniable evidence of Sarah's video, and the relentless pressure of the press. Jessica Flynn's exposé had triggered a federal investigation that stripped Frank Miller of his title, his assets, and his freedom. He was now serving the first year of a 20-year sentence in a maximum security facility for assault, corruption, and animal cruelty. The shadow he had cast over Sarah's life was finally, permanently, lifted. With the legal battle over, Sarah had liquidated her father's estate, the mansion, the cars, the dirty money, and poured every cent into this dream. She watched a volunteer walk a three-legged pit bull across the lawn, speaking to the animal in gentle words of encouragement. This was her kingdom now, a place where the broken came to be made whole. "Penny, for your thoughts?" A low, warm voice came from behind her. Sarah didn't startle. She turned with a radiant smile, finding Jack leaning in the doorway. He looked different, too. The coiled tension of the combat soldier had softened at the edges. He wasn't wearing body armor or tactical gear. He wore a simple canvas jacket and work boots. Jack had been honorably discharged 2 months ago. The Navy had offered him a desk job or a training position, but he'd turned them down. He had found a new mission, one that didn't require a rifle. He was the head trainer and facilities manager here, the quiet guardian of every soul that passed through the gates. "I was just thinking," Sarah said, looking out at the yard, "how quiet it is here. Not the scary kind of quiet. The peaceful kind." Jack came to stand beside her, resting his elbows on the railing. "It suits you," he said softly. "Peace." A commotion near the barn drew their attention. Kaiser, a magnificent picture of black and tan fur, came tearing around the corner, chasing a tennis ball with the enthusiasm of a puppy. He had filled out, his coat glossy and thick, rippling over powerful muscles. The scar on the side of his head was still there, a jagged line of white fur through the black, but it wasn't a mark of shame. It was a badge of honor. He no longer limped, thanks to Dr. Reed's surgery and months of rehabilitation. He moved with a joyful, fluid grace. He caught the ball midair and trotted to the porch, dropping it at Jack's feet with a demanding woof. Jack laughed, a rich, genuine sound he wouldn't have known he was capable of 6 months ago. He bent down to scratch the dog behind the ears. "You ever get tired, buddy?" Jack teased. Kaiser leaned into the touch, his tail thumping a steady rhythm against the floorboards. He looked between Jack and Sarah, his pack, his family, and let out a contented sigh. Today was the official grand opening. Cars had begun parking along the gravel drive. It wasn't a gala with champagne and fake smiles. It was a community gathering. There were families with kids, local farmers, and people who had seen the news and wanted to help. Among the arriving guests was Deputy Evans, the young cop who had let them go that day on the road. He was out of uniform, holding hands with his wife, looking around with a proud smile. Dr. Reed was there, too, grumbling about the cold but secretly beaming as she inspected the new medical wing Sarah had built in the barn. Even Jessica Flynn had driven down from the city to cover the happy ending to the story she helped write. The support was overwhelming. It was proof that while evil existed, goodness was more abundant if you knew where to look. "It's about time," Jack said, checking his watch. "They're waiting for you." Sarah took a deep breath, suddenly nervous. "I'm not good at speeches," she confessed. "I'm better at mucking out kennels." Jack turned to her, his expression serious, but full of an intense warmth. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "You're the bravest person I know," he said. "You stood up to a monster and won. You built all this. Just speak from the heart. I'll be right beside you." Sarah squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his solid presence. Over the last few months, their bond had deepened into something profound. It wasn't a whirlwind romance born from trauma. It was a slow-burning fire built on mutual respect, healing, and a quiet, abiding love. They had saved each other. They walked down the steps together with Kaiser trotting at their side like a royal guard. A small crowd had gathered around a makeshift podium near the barn entrance. A round of applause went up as they approached. It was warm, genuine applause that made Sarah blush. She stepped up to the microphone, her hand still in Jack's. She looked out at the faces in the crowd, Evans, Helen, Jenny, the volunteers. She looked down at Kaiser, who sat proudly at her feet, his chest puffed out. "Thank you all for coming," Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. 6 months ago, I didn't think I'd see another sunrise. I was trapped in a place where love was a weakness and loyalty was punished. But I learned something that day. I learned that family isn't about blood. It's about who stands beside you when the darkness comes. She looked at Jack, her eyes shining. This center is named for Kaiser, but it belongs to all of us. It's a promise that no matter how broken you are, You can heal. You can trust again, and you can find a home. The crowd cheered, some wiping away tears. Jack stepped forward then, clearing his throat. He wasn't one for long speeches, so he kept it simple. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a new collar. It was made of sturdy leather, and hanging from it was a small, silver medallion in the shape of a shield. He knelt in front of Kaiser. The dog sat perfectly still, sensing the solemnity of the moment. "Kaiser," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion, "you held the line. You protected the innocent. You are the best soldier I have ever had the privilege of serving with." He fastened the collar around the dog's neck. The silver shield glinted in the autumn sun. "Protector," Jack whispered. Kaiser licked Jack across the face, breaking the serious mood and making the crowd laugh. As the ceremony broke up and people began to tour the facility, enjoying donuts and cider, the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of violet and gold. The air grew cooler, hinting at the coming winter, but there was no fear of the cold here. Jack and Sarah stood by the fence line, watching Kaiser run through the tall grass with a pack of rescue dogs. A three-legged pit bull, a blind beagle, and an anxious collie who was finally learning how to play. It was a chaotic, beautiful symphony of freedom. Jack wrapped an arm around Sarah's waist, pulling her close. She rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart. "We did a good thing," Jack murmured, kissing the top of her head. "We did," Sarah agreed. "So, Sergeant, what's our next mission?" Jack smiled, looking out at the horizon, where the sun was setting on their past and rising on their future. He looked at the woman he loved and the dog who had brought them together. "Mission Protect is complete," Jack said softly. "Mission Love? That one's just getting started." Kaiser paused in his run, looking back at them with a happy, open-mouthed grin before turning to chase the wind into the sunset.